Hi guys, welcome back to another video. My name is James. Today we're here to talk about The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. We're not here to talk about how crap my copy looks after having read it, because that's just a natural state of my possessions. So, The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. This is an epic fantasy, but it's not a high fantasy. There's some confusion about getting those two terms mixed up, but this is an epic fantasy novel that is based on Chinese history, much like the Poppy War was, only this is based on more ancient history than the Poppy War. This is based on what was known as the Chu-Han conflict. It was a clash between rival imperial dynasties to create a united China. That's real history. This is about two guys. One is called Mata Zindu, one is called Kunigaru, almost forgot his name there. They both take part in a rebellion against the Emperor Mapadere, who has unleashed a war on the islands of Dara, which is where this novel is set. He has unleashed a war on the islands of Dara and has conquered it, becoming the first emperor. And now there's an uprising against him, obviously, and these two guys, Kunigaru and Matazindu, are kind of like the figureheads of this rebellion. They become the sort of leaders of the rebellion, and then it sort of goes from there, and how like the two ideologies of these two guys clashes and how they grow together as friends over time. So let's talk about it. I'll put the book down. It was really, really good. As in simple terms, if all you care about is whether I like the book or not, there's your answer. I really enjoyed this book. I rated it 5 stars. That's not the highest of praise, because I give out 5 stars pretty easily these days. But let's talk about some of the reasons why. So first of all, you've got this really unique setting. It was something in the Poppy War that I was disappointed with, was this real lack of like a real setting. You got glimpses of the world building that had gone into the Poppy War, and I'm sure as the books go on in that series it's going to develop more. But in Grace of Kings you really got this idea of all these different islands, and the people being kind of different in each one, and you get a sense of the culture and history of this place, and why an empire wouldn't be to their liking for a lot of the time. And that's something that's really important with a book like this, something that's so politically driven. You have to really understand the core identities of the nations and what their belief systems are and things, to understand why having an outside force come in and change that would be in conflict to them, especially considering the empire itself is sort of really well fleshed out. It starts off as this typical evil empire where you're like, oh man, these guys are the bad guys and our guys are the good guys. I want to see the bad guys lose. But as the novel goes on, you get more nuance with the empire, and they are fleshed out, and you sort of start to see their side of the story, and you sort of understand why, you know, the emperor had this vision for a united, a united kingdom. He's not English, but it was the dream of the United Kingdom, to unite all of these different, nation states and islands and bring them together to make them stronger. Like, it's very much a what did the Romans ever do for us kind of situation, if you're familiar with that reference. It's, he introduces sanitation and kind of like a united currency and trade routes and safety and security and all of that kind of stuff, but it's at the expense of these various cultures, and that's an interesting idea that's explored through the novel. And we get to see different ideologies within the rebel faction. There is very early on, there's much a sense of these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. It's no real shades of grey. And I think that was done with intent by Ken Liu, because this is very much it's got a very romanticism kind of style, and by that I don't mean it's all about love and romance. I mean it's all about very grand, sweeping gestures, and very larger than life characters. Like Mata Zindu is described as being 8 feet tall, and he's got fucking doors for hands, and he's got this sword that no one can pick up. Like people struggle to hold it with 2 hands, but he's like one-handing it, and he's got a fucking massive club in the other hand. You know, it's very over the top, but that is sort of there is a flavour of Chinese literature that has that roots. Like it's the Romance of the Three Kingdoms is like the big Chinese historical epic that has that style, and I think Kennedy wanted to bring that forward, but what he also brought forward with that is very plain. I don't want to say plain characters because they're quite they're quite flavourful, but he's brought very simple characters. That's not to say that they are lacking in depth or emotions or any of that. They're very believable characters, but they are much more in line with an ideal. Like you can say Mata Zindu is this, and Kunigaru is this way, and you can it makes it kind of predictable, but also very easy to approach. You get a good handle on what the characters are about and what their goals and ambitions are, and they don't really deviate from that much at any point. And you can sort of see the writing is kind of on the wall in terms of the character growth from the very start. Kuni and Mata come into conflict in the story, and it's quite obvious what it was to me, at least. I found it quite easy to predict how that story was going to end, just based on the information we know about the characters. There's not too many twists and turns, even though it's quite a political fantasy. It's not like a Game of Thrones where every third page is a fucking mega twist. The characters, it's aided by a omniscient narrator perspective. It's third person omniscient narration, which can be a bit awkward for some people actually, because we're so used to reading third person limited now, or first person, but this is all third person omniscient, so you get perspectives of all the characters depending on what's the most useful perspective to have at the time. That means you get a much better insight into sort of everyone. You understand why the emperor's made these decisions, you understand why other people in the Empire act the way they do, and they're not all moustache-twirling villains. Some of them are acting for good reasons, some of them for bad, but you sort of get this flavour of everyone's viewpoint. But as a side of it being omniscient, as a reader that when people are lying and when they're not. So it gives a really sort of interesting layer of dramatic irony to some of the characters' actions, because when two characters meet and they have a misunderstanding, you have to sort of do the work to think about what each of these two characters would know, because you as the reader know who is and isn't telling the truth, and if two characters are being truthful come into conflict over someone lying, you're just sitting there yelling at the page like, no, you fool, he was on your side. It sort of adds this element of heightened drama for the reader. It makes it kind of much more operatic than some fantasy where you're just following this one guy and you're experiencing the twists at the same time he is. So it's really interesting. It also deviates a lot from westernized fantasy novels where, just through the power structure, Kunigaru becomes who he is through his ability to be a bureaucrat and to organize. He organizes things, and that is what ultimately helps him win a lot of his situations, is that he is just better at planning and delegating work to people, and he comes from nothing, so it's a very much like a self-made man kind of story. In Western fantasy, it tends to take the other route where it's a top-down approach, where you've got the king on the top and he delegates to his underling and his underling and his underling, and there's no social mobility there really. apart from if you're born into it or you're married into it. That is something that really differentiates this book from other fantasy novels that you might be experienced with, and that adds to the Chinese mythology, Chinese society kind of flavour to it. This book does everything that I wanted the Poppy War to do, but it does it, in my opinion, much better. It has elements of... the fantasy elements are very limited, but they come in with these, there's a magic gas. I guess it's not a magic gas. It's kind of more science fiction-y, really. But it's this, special gas that only grows in this one volcano that expands and allows hot air balloons to exist, essentially. So they have silk warships that fly through the sky and they drop fucking firebombs on them. But the fantasy elements are very sort of relegated to the background. The main fantasy element that we get is we get POV of the gods of the islands. There's a god for each island in this sort of archipelago, and they all have their interpersonal rivalries, the gods are having a rivalry, and they have picked human champions because they aren't able to directly influence events that happen in the world. So in order to force their ideology forward, to further their own goals, they have to sort of subtly influence the mortals under them in order to get them to do what they want. So it's really interesting having that perspective, and that being really at this point the only fantasy element. There's some other bits here and there, but it's very low fantasy. Imagine early seasons of Game of Thrones, the show, or the early Song of Ice and Fire books, before we literally had fucking dragons flying everywhere and little goblin kids throwing fucking fireballs at skeleton warriors. Before we had all that, it was very much more subtle fantasy in Game of Thrones, and it's much more subtle fantasy here in The Grace of Kings as well. One of the more overt magic things is there's this smoke that one of the characters is able to use to manipulate people's ability to think. But even then, it's the romanticism angle, isn't it? In romanticism, there's a guy who was super good at strategizing and setting up environmental traps and spreading fire, attacking with fire, and people might have said he's a fucking wizard, he can just summon fire and boulders out of nowhere, but that's not true, right? It's exaggerated for dramatic effect, and that's kind of what's happening here. I feel there's Ken Liu's taken this idea of there's this woman and she's got this smoke and it'll fuck with your head, but it could just be some fucking weird drugs or incense, you have to sort of peel back the layers of the fantasy, just because that's the kind of story it is, and that's sort of the vein of literature it's trying to crib from. And I thought it was done really, really well. So I'm looking forward to the next book, which is The Wall of Storms. I have it on my shelf, bought it with my Christmas money. Thanks for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one. It might be another quick thoughts video on the natural history of dragons, which I'm currently working through. I'm hoping I've only got less than a day left. No, well, I've got a day and the rest of today. So I've got the rest of today and tomorrow, but I'm at work tomorrow, to read Natural History of Dragons and film a review of it if I want to include it in my 2018 stable. So that's it. I'm going. I'll see you in the next video, and thanks for watching. Bye.